Today on Ascend, the Great Books podcast, we welcome Dr. Gregory McBrayer of the new Thinkery podcast to discuss the third part of Plato's Gorgias, the dialogue with Callicles. We'll hear the story behind how the new Thinkery podcast got started, and then discuss whether it's proper to call Callicles a nihilist, whether Gorgias is aware he's producing little tyrants, and whether it is Callicles and not Socrates who is unprepared for his final trial and judgment. I greatly enjoyed my conversation with Dr. McBrayer. He was incredibly insightful and helped make some of the more difficult passages in this dialogue clean and clear. It was just really wonderful to meet him. You should know this episode will be published both by Ascend and our friends at the New Thinkery podcast. On the Ascend side, it will come out in late 2025 as part of our study on Plato, while on the New Thinkery side, it will come out whenever they please. So join us today for an excellent conversation on Plato's Gorgias, the dialogue with Callicles. Welcome to Ascend at the Great Books podcast. My name is Deacon Harrison Garlick. I'm a husband, father of 5, and serve as Chancellor and General Counsel for the Roman Catholic Diocese of Tulsa. I'm recording on a beautiful morning here in my office at the Chancery. If you're new to Ascend, we're a weekly podcast that helps guide you through the great books. It's our goal to be like a small group to people, especially first-time readers. And we have podcast videos and written guides to help you read the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Oresteia, the Bacchae, and much more. Check us out on X, YouTube, Facebook, and Patreon. We appreciate all of our supporters. And visit thegreatbookspodcast.com for our reading schedule and more information. Today, we are continuing our studies into Plato. Together, we've read and discussed first Alcibiades, the Euthyphro, Apology, Crito, Phaedo, the Meno, and today we are finishing our 3-part series on the Gorgias, looking particularly at the section with Callicles. To help guide us through the third part of the Gorgias, we are joined by an excellent guest, Dr. Gregory McBrayer, who serves as a director of the core curriculum and as an assistant professor of political science at Ashland University. He's done some excellent work on the thinker Xenophon, Socrates' other student, and is a co-host of the new Thinkery podcast, an excellent great books and philosophy podcast. Welcome.
Thanks, Deacon. It's a pleasure to be here. You guys are doing some amazing things with this podcast. I sort of envy your success. We need, like, even your intro is so much more professional than ours. We usually begin with, silly words.
I don't have, multiple co-hosts interrupting me and making jokes, so right. I'm not really sure you could talk that long on the new Thinkery.
Yeah. I don't know what to do with all this politeness and praise.
I'll try and throw in some ribald humor that makes you feel more at home. Yeah, but tell us about the new Thinkery.
Sure. It's a podcast. Gosh, we've been going about 5 years at this point. We have weekly episodes, which we are realizing is a pace that is difficult to maintain. I don't know what your kind of schedule is. It's just 3 guys. I can tell you how it started. There were sort of 2 sort of basic starting points. One is I was starting a new job here at Ashland University working at the Ashbrook Center. The Ashbrook Center sort of has a big public outreach in education, mostly around American civics. So David Barr, my co-host, he's friends with Bill Crystal, formerly of the Weekly Standard, and he has a very successful podcast called Conversations with Bill Crystal. David got Bill graciously to agree to meet with me one time, and we were just talking about starting a podcast, and I was sort of thinking about doing something kind of Ashbrooky, American civics, and at one point he just said, why don't you just do what you really want to do? And it sounds like you really want to do political philosophy. And I said, oh, that's okay. And so I filed that away. And then on sort of a different sort of step, Alex Priu, the other co-host, and we would go to conferences, and I don't look at now because this was 5 years ago, but we were kind of youngish for scholars. And when we go to conferences, we would notice that grad students on one hand and elderly kind of statesmen professors on the other enjoyed listening to us sort of because we would have sort of serious conversations and I think fairly decent interpretations of texts mixed in with sort of juvenile junior high banter. And we noticed that, man, really people really seem to like this mix of things. And so David, Alex, and I got together. David and Alex are very good friends. And we said, we should really just do this. And then, COVID hit. We sort of thought now's the time. And we've been having a lot of fun. It's opened doors. I think it's helped Alex get a job. I think it's helped me get some publication opportunities, this podcast invitation. It's just been a lot of fun. And it's a good way for, especially during COVID, but since then still, it's a good way to stay in touch with friends who live so far apart. Yeah. And of course, the name, as the name implies, we sort of see ourselves as in the spirit of Aristophanes, because the Thinkery, of course, is the place that Socrates taught out in his famous play called The Clouds. Maybe that's obvious, but worth saying.
And you guys have also adopted his sense of humor for your podcast.
Yeah, it's the blend. We like to fancy that it's the blend of the low and the high. You see, I mean, we do metaphysics, ontology, epistemology, and fart jokes. So it's yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting mix. No, I appreciate the podcast. I enjoy listening. Actually, I listened to your all's episode this morning on the Gorgias
Oh, thanks.
as I was driving in. And I should tell you thank you, because I think in that episode is one that you recommended, The People of Plato.
Yeah, Deborah Nails.
Yes, that book is excellent. I picked
It's
that
so
up
good.
as we were launching into the studies on Plato, and
Yeah.
it's a phenomenal resource.
I even checked just this morning myself her passage on Callicles to make sure that I was correct. So we're talking about Callicles and the Gorgias, and there's some dispute. I sort of thought he was a fictional character. I still think that, but at least Dodd maybe, according to Deborah Nails, there's at least one classicist who thinks that Callicles was in fact a real person. So maybe there's some dispute about that. But yeah, no, it's an invaluable resource. I always can't pronounce the word right. Prospography, maybe, is that what it's called?
I'll defer to you.
Yeah. And anyway, it sort of has one-page summaries of every single character who appears in Plato. And at the end, there's even, I want to say there's like an attempt to date the dialogues dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very helpful too. Yeah, it's a great resource.
Yeah. And I think too, I was familiar with your podcast before I had ever read The Clouds by Aristophanes.
How about that?
And so so anyway, when we read Aristophanes' The Clouds on the podcast, I had on Zena Hitz.
Oh,
sure.
Wonderful
conversation. She's fantastic. Yeah. But there were so many times on that podcast, I had to stop myself from saying new Thinkery, because that word, the only time I ever used the word Thinkery was your podcast. And so it's like, well, Socrates is here with his new Thinkery. I probably messed up like 4 or 5 times on the episode because of that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Zena was on our show just a couple weeks ago. She's great. She's done it's a great public service, what she's done, sort of getting folks interested in the great books. She started the Catherine Project, which is great. So inspired our work. I'm sure it had an influence on you. I mean, and so many of us are doing these great things, right? Like this thing you're doing, the ASCENT podcast. I mean, putting great books before people. There's a real hunger out there, I think. Even MC Hammer is interested in doing these things. And so, yeah, people are interested in these things.
I think there is a hunger, and I really appreciate it, particularly that, that these great texts, like one of the reasons, kind of like scripture. So I think it's St. Gregory the Great says that scripture is where, the lamb can wade and the elephant can swim. So it kind of invites you into this depth that's proportionate to your own level of engagement. I think a lot of the great books are like that too. So people are put off by like, well, I can't ever read the Iliad, or, I got 4 lines into the Iliad and there's all these names and whatever. And what we've learned here on ASCENT is just like a little bit of help, just like, hey, mainly like a lot of encouragement, like you can do this. And also like, here's just like, 2 guys talking about this text, like, and it really does allow people, I think, to engage in the text. And I've been really humbled because we've had, people send in pictures and like guys, they're working as mechanics or something and then sending us pictures that they're reading, a book of the Iliad on their lunch break. And I think there's like really something beautiful to that.
One of my favorite notes we got from a listener was a woman who's described herself as a homemaker in Great Britain. And she said she would listen to us while she's doing household chores, that she had studied philosophy way back in undergraduate. Anyway, yeah, I agree. I think it's sort of crazy. I mean, Homer wasn't writing for scholars. Plato wasn't writing for scholars. Right? They're writing for the idea that these great texts are the preserve of an intellectually trained class is sort of bonkers. And I think that many of these great thinkers would sort of be sad to know that their primary readers are people. So you mentioned Aristophanes, for example, right? Like I've been at conference after conference where you hear some professor talk about Aristophanes and it's not funny. And you're like, dude, like this is funny stuff. Like there's poop jokes. Like it's okay to laugh at them. And sort of, there's something sort of perverse about thinking that this is preserve of the scholarly class. So it's nice to hear that mechanics are listening, homemakers are listening, ordinary folks are listening. That's great.
I think I'd be interested like on your thoughts on this. Like when I talked on our first episode on the Gorgias, we talked about, I talked with Athenian Stranger and Jonathan B., both who also have kind of great books, philosophy projects that are kind of aimed at just, the common people, just like everyone can come. Right. And one thing that I think we noticed is that on a lot of times, these people who start these projects, there's like an authentic like eros for this wisdom, right? Like it's because the good tends to be diffusive. So like if I find something that I really think is like good and true and beautiful, I naturally want to share it. And it seems like sometimes, not to be like overly critical, but it seems like at times that's a really stark contrast between sometimes what you get in academics, because it's like sometimes this is like more sterile. It's more just like an intellectual pursuit, as
Yeah.
opposed to like, hey, I have found something beautiful and I want to share it with you, which tends to make like for very lively and also even humorous conversations, very human conversations.
Yeah, that's right. One of the worst classes I ever took in college was on Plato. And I just thought, how did this professor take one of the most beautiful things in the world and ruin it? Yeah, I mean, it's a real problem. I mean, I've been on some hiring committees here. I've tried to hire other faculty, and I always want somebody whose passion for learning is contagious. And I meet so many academics and scholars who it doesn't seem to be a burning question that they're trying to figure out. It's just sort of, oh, it's just this kind of cool thing that I was into, like stamp collecting or video games. And it's like, no, man, like, I mean, if that's why you're here, I don't, I want to be surrounded by people who have burning questions, even if they're not the same questions that I have.
Yeah, because I think
I'm
too.
trying to figure this out, Yeah.
Yeah, because I think too, what it does is another aspect of that is that it dovetails into the way that you live, right? So philosophy and religion can't just simply be like, this is my, like stamp collecting. It's just a thing I do on the side and I
Right.
live over here. And sometimes you see that, or
Right.
this is like just an intellectual game that I find, that I'm good at, but over
Right.
here I live like this, as opposed to like, even like this dialogue, like the section we're going to talk about today with Callicles,
Right.
particularly the ending myth. Like some of these things really challenged me on, okay, how do I live my life? Do I take these things seriously? And there's a certain beauty that I think you kind of absorb as you kind of move, particularly through Plato. Like how am I actually living my life?
Yeah, for sure. No, I
So
mean, it was a way of life for Socrates. I mean, philosophy was not an academic discipline. These were questions that mattered, and it's not something that, everything you just said, I concur wholeheartedly with. Yeah.
So when you read the Gorgias with your students,
Right.
like it's a long dialogue.
Sure.
You can get lost in it, I think, pretty easily. Even rereading the Callicles section, like sometimes they just keep going back and back to the same point. Sometimes,
Right.
why do you tell them this is a dialogue worth reading? Like, why read this dialogue?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I've taught it a lot, actually. Most recently this semester, I'm teaching it in a class on rhetoric, which maybe you'd want to talk about more. But for the most part, I've taught this book in just a class called Introduction to Political Philosophy. And one of the reasons I do it is because I think that it's best to put whole books in front of students from the beginning and to have them walk through it. And I think the Republic is an obvious choice for freshmen to read, except I think it's too big. I just think it's hard, and like, let's get through something that can give them a sense of accomplishment. So the Gorgias is a much smaller dialogue than the Republic, maybe a tenth as long, in fact. And so for that reason, I teach it. There are a couple of other reasons that I teach it. One is that the Republic is about justice, and the Gorgias is about rhetoric. But really, it's about rhetoric about justice, and so it's very similar in that regard. If you've read the Republic, if your listeners have read the Republic, they'll know that Book One of the Republic has Socrates engaged with three main interlocutors, right? Cephalus, and then Cephalus's son Polemarchus, and then this sort of nasty fellow Thrasymachus. But then Book One ends, and you pick it up in Book Two. And so I know some professors who only teach Book One of the Republic in an intro class. I'm like, I don't want to end with there's 9 more books. The Gorgias is about very much the same questions that the Republic addresses. It's about justice, right? I mean, there really is. It's about how one ought to live. I mean, Callicles is actually the guy that brings this question ultimately to the fore. Like, actually, what we're really talking about is how we ought to live. But you'll notice also that the structure of Book One of the Republic kind of parallels the structure of the Gorgias, or maybe it's vice versa, that first there's an old guy speaking, then his heir speaks, and then a nasty guy speaks. And so in a way, it's addressing many of the same questions that the Republic draws out, but in a more contained environment. I'll also say that I think it's useful. I've been doing this now for some time, a couple of decades. I don't want to overplay this, but I think it's useful for students in the Platonic dialogues for there to be a bad guy. And so, there's more sophisticated dialogues one could do, but I think when you're trying to introduce somebody, I teach the Protagoras fairly regularly, for example, for similar reasons. I think Protagoras is a very nasty fellow. And it's useful for students to see Socrates standing up to these nasty types and sort of vindicating the life of, let's just say, virtue or something like this. And that happens here. I think Gorgias actually is not a very nasty guy, but I don't think he's thought through the implications of what he does. And what he does is actually empower other nasty people to be very nasty. And so I think that there's that reason as well. And then in the rhetoric course, I teach it because I think this is a critique of rhetoric, that if we're going to study rhetoric together, one needs to take seriously the possibility that rhetoric is actually morally bad and maybe you shouldn't be in this class. Or at least you should have these reservations at the top of your mind if we're going to read this together, if we're going to study rhetoric. So I hope that answers it. It's fun. I know it's long, but it is short compared to other dialogues. There's a hero, there's a bad guy. It ends on a sort of curious note you've already alluded to of a myth. I don't know what to do with that. Maybe we can talk about that as we get there. Does that kind of get at the
Yeah, no, I think that was well said.
Yeah.
No, I think that it's interesting that you talk about the need of a bad guy, because it's in my mind, it's actually Callicles that makes the dialogue.
Oh yeah, no question.
The whole veneer is gone. We're unashamed. And now we're just going to have this kind of like cold and hot conversation. And I talked about this with my kind of men small group that meets at my house. You know, there were allusions, to Christ, right? The lukewarm or spit out of the mouth. There's something about being hot or cold that actually allows things to progress and for the truth to actually come forward. But I appreciate what you said, though, because this has been a question as we've kind of moved through the text, is the disposition of Gorgias.
Yeah.
So, like when I first read this, one of the questions was, what caught my attention was the fact that Gorgias keeps interjecting.
Right.
And seems to have, this is in dialogues, it's always dangerous, right? But he seems to have somewhat of a genuine interest in hearing what Socrates has to say. Yes. This seemed to bring up a contrast of so at first I was like, oh, okay, so maybe there's a way to read this where Gorgias he hasn't actually fully understood that he's creating little tyrants. Like he has certain contradictions that he's held in his head that he doesn't seem to have ferreted out. And so the dialogue with Polus and with Callicles is pedagogical to Gorgias. Is that how you read it? Or I guess a contrast would be, the dialogue starts with a reference to war, and this is a very antagonistic.
The very first word is war, in fact, right?
Right, and this is an antagonistic dialogue. We talk about being knocked on the jaw. It also has some vulgarity in it, some things that aren't always in other dialogues, and so sometimes people read this as this no, Gorgias he's Callicles, but he's more refined. He knows how to play the game. Yeah. And there's these two different ways to read Gorgias, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Look, first off, I think Callicles is the nastiest character in all of Plato. He, like you said, he physically threatens Socrates. I'd like to whoop you in the mouth. You sissy, something like this, right? I suppose all readers of Socrates have probably been there at some point. But I'll suggest that, I'll take this question of Gorgias's character. First of all, I mentioned the Protagoras as another dialogue that I teach in introductory courses. And one of the reasons is because I think Protagoras is actually quite nasty. I think Protagoras does think that he's beyond good and evil. I think that I don't want to develop it, but if you want, we can try to. I think Protagoras is actually a teacher of injustice. I think that he thinks he's crystal clear about this, but that he has to be very coy in revealing it because he doesn't want to upset people. But that justice is for schmucks. We all know it. Socrates, you know it. I know it. Wink, wink, nod, nod. And I think Socrates is very carefully trying to protect some of the young people, Hippocrates, from this pernicious influence of this guy, Protagoras, who's nasty. I think he's a teacher of injustice. Gorgias, I think, is like a guy who's teaching people to shoot, but he's not aware that you can use a gun to kill people. Maybe you shouldn't just go off and teach people to use semi-automatic weapons without sort of some kind of moral education. I suspect that the dialogue begins. It's initiated by Socrates' desire to speak with Gorgias, which is kind of a curious thing. So I suspect that Socrates has actually a genuine interest in learning about rhetoric from Gorgias, but quickly realizes Gorgias may not have much to say. And it turns, as you mentioned, I think, so it begins with Socrates wanting to learn from Gorgias. And I think that that's sincere, and we can talk about that. But I think at a certain point when he realizes, well, there's not much to learn from this guy, he then turns the tables and realizes, oh, this guy might need me to teach him. And so I'm going to teach him. I suspect that Socrates' conversation with Polus and then with Callicles is largely for the sake of Gorgias. And I'll just say one other further thing in defense of Gorgias. I think he sees rhetoric as a kind of neutral, powerful tool, all-powerful tool. And by the way, he's sort of a decentish fellow. Like the first example that he gives to prove he's very good at rhetoric is, I can help my brother, who's a medical doctor, persuade people to submit to medicine. That's a kind of a morally salutary thing. Like rhetoric actually can do these good things. I can help people get the treatment they need. I can help politics, this kind of thing. But I think his sales pitch to young is that's not the sales pitch to the young. The sales pitch to the young is, if I teach you this art, you'll get away with whatever you want. You'll get away with murder. But I don't think he's seriously realized how that sounds and that these kids are actually taking him up on it. And so I suspect, you mentioned at several points in the conversation with Callicles that Gorgias steps in and interjects. And at one point, Callicles wants to stop talking even. And Gorgias is like, no, you keep going, submit to Socrates. And I suspect it's because this is the first time that Gorgias has seen the effect of his own education on the young. And I suspect he's somewhat horrified by what he's producing. So I think he's kind of a decentish fellow who's not therefore very thoughtful and hasn't thought through the implications of what he's doing. That's my take.
No, I think that's very well said. That tends to align, I think, with my intuition of reading through the text, of just why it's going on and why. Because I think a lot of times, as I've been reading through Plato, a lot of times you have to realize, like, what is Socrates' actually goal here, right? Like, so for instance, like in First Alcibiades, when he talks to Alcibiades, he proves to him he doesn't know what justice is. And as in a lot of first time readers of Plato are like, oh, great. So this is where Socrates then explains to him what justice means. No, he just moves on because the point was to show you that you don't know what you're talking about. Right. You see something similar in Euthyphro. Like I think that Plato certainly had the capacity to carry a conversation about piety and the divine much deeper than he did in there. Right. But he gets to the point in which Euthyphro then becomes perplexed. And a positive reading of that is that Euthyphro doesn't go and do what he was going to, right?
Right.
So here too, in the Gorgias, in a somewhat analogous way, I was trying to figure out like who is the dialogue with Callicles for?
Right.
Callicles is completely recalcitrant. He doesn't seem to be absorbing this at all. And I like your read that I think that it's actually for the sake of Gorgias, maybe only incidental, and for the crowd, because I guess we have to keep in mind that there's other young men here, right?
Chaerephon, especially. Just real quick, the Euthyphro, don't you wish that, isn't it curious that Plato chooses like this complete idiot for Socrates to talk about one of the most important things in the world?
Right.
Don't you wish Plato had said, no, we'll have Socrates speak to, Augustine or something like that. Obviously that's chronologically correct, but anyway, yeah. So it's this most, and by the way, Euthyphro claims to be a prophet,
right?
He claims to receive revelation. And it's like, he's just a dummy. I wish that he had put a more impressive person there for Socrates to discuss with, but yeah.
I appreciated the episodes that you guys did on the Euthyphro on Strauss's notebook.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Yeah. We had recourse to that when we went through the Euthyphro too. I picked up that notebook and I thought it was really
good.
Really
it's very helpful. It's very helpful for sure.
So maybe to kind of get into the dialogue proper. So one of the things that I noticed, like right here at the beginning, is when he jumps in, like he thinks Socrates might be jesting, right? Like it's really, and he says, if Socrates is correct, right? If you're actually saying what's true, the whole world's going to turn upside down.
Everyone's upside down, right?
And I wonder, and this kind of dovetails into some of your points as well. But one thing that I think, as I've been reading through in our studies of Plato with ASCENT, that has become apparent to me, or at least it's my perspective at the moment that was not before, is that I tend to think of nihilism as a modern phenomenon. That it's something that has like come up kind of out of the corpse of a Christian culture.
Yeah.
And we're fighting. This is an issue that like Nietzsche and this is the Camus and all these things. That's who we talk about here.
Right.
But I've come to understand that nihilism really is something not by name but by presence, I guess. Is something that actually is haunting the Platonic dialogues as well. That these young men, look at Callicles. Like there's nothing here to life besides maximizing my pleasure. And so it's interesting to me that right at the beginning, it's like if it's true, if Socrates is teaching, which to us nowadays we're so downstream from him, like the things he's saying, like, oh yeah, take the soul seriously and you should be virtuous. And, it is better to suffer injustice than to commit one. Like how antagonistic or opposite that's going to sound to a culture like Callicles, if that makes sense, right? This whole world's been turned upside down.
Yeah. That's a great, so maybe we should talk a little bit about this. So obviously I think Callicles is somewhat confused. And I think that he may be more attached to moral things than he recognizes about himself. You mentioned the shame business. We can get to that maybe. And sort of, this is some of the most vulgar or shameful passages in all of Plato as well. But he talks about nature being the standard. And so he is interested in, there is some kind of a standard for Callicles. Now, so, this is right around 483E, where he says it's sort of natural law that the strong rule or something like this. I guess I should make sure I'm precise in my speech just to make sure that I have this right.
Yeah, he says justice by nature holds the superior rule the inferior and have a greater share.
Yeah, he says it's a law of nature, which is, by the way, this is a contradiction in terms, I think, in Greek. And he even says it, right? Yes, that's exactly what I mean, by the way. So he does think there's some kind of natural order. So I don't know. I mean, you're right. Maybe it ultimately is nihilistic, but I think he at least sees for himself like there is a natural order, and it's that the strong rule and the weak suffer. There are lions and gazelles, Socrates, and I'm a lion. Something like this.
Yeah, no, that's a good distinction. Yeah, it's interesting that he brings up. I found him really persuasive at the beginning when he makes this distinction between law and nature, simply because it did actually do some rhetorical work to kind of deconstruct what Socrates had been talking about.
Yeah.
But basically, the error is you're applying two different standards, and so you're equivocating as you've kind of moved through this. And so maybe just as like a summary,
Yeah.
so he says, like we said, it's 483 A. Yeah, so law then, when he says law, what I took him to mean is like this is instituted by the weak and the many,
Yeah.
right, to their own advantage. So this is that kind of the demos, right, this democratic nature. And this frightens the more powerful men, right? So it pushes the more powerful men by nature, not by law, into submission.
Right.
And then nature is like this power to rule. You deserve a greater share. You're a better man by nature.
Right.
And so, I mean, another thing, there's a few things there that I think are interesting. One, particularly kind of coming from like a Catholic tradition and like how we're habituated to these terms being used, is one that law and nature are antagonistic. They're opposed to one another.
Right.
Right. As opposed to every time we typically, at least in the Catholic tradition, hear
together,
between law and nature, you pull your law from nature. There's a harmony.
Right.
The other thing too that's fascinating here, and I think Athenian Stranger pointed this out as well, is that like, is this our first reference to natural law?
Yeah, I think so.
Is actually then that the superior governs the inferior, that the might makes right?
Yeah, yeah. And he swears, right? To sort of in other words, I suspect when Callicles says, "Look, this is at 483e." Or one could tell of myriad other such cases. Indeed, I think these men do these things according to the nature of the just. And yes, by Zeus, yes, damn it, according to the law of nature. And I suspect he swears there because he recognizes that this is a contradiction in terms. And so it's to emphasize, I'm aware that I'm saying something that sounds contradictory, but I'm telling you, in fact, there is a law of nature. And it's that the strong rule and the weak suffer, yeah.
Yeah, it's really fascinating that the first time we get that, it's in a context that's opposite of how we typically take it in the West.
No, that's very true. But you do get the implication there that Callicles recognizes that in the Greek mind, those are separate notions. I mean, I think that the sort of common way that a lot of folks have thought about it is that the discovery of physis, the discovery of nature, or the distinction between nature and convention is what allows for philosophy to come into its own. That you recognize that people have different conventions, and that fire burns everywhere the same, but that people have different laws with respect to what to do to the dead or something. Maybe this is in Herodotus, right?
Yeah, I think Aristotle uses a similar example in his Nicomachean Ethics to talk about natural justice, right?
Good. So for the Socratics, I think it makes more sense to speak of natural right or natural justice. And then later, you're right, according to later Christian, especially Christian, but Romans before them begin to talk about what's legal by nature, the law, natural law. That's right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's just fascinating that it pops up like this. But is there a way? I mean, I like the slight defense that you gave for Callicles there, that he is looking at the world with some type of order and intelligibility, assuming to whatever degree we take him to be, being honest. But isn't there too this dynamic though of the one against the many?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a way that that's also true even for Socrates, right? Because the philosopher versus the many, right? We see this in the Apology. We see some sections in here. So it's interesting because Callicles sets up this dynamic, but the template, I guess, the pattern of one versus the many, there's a way that that's also true for Socrates as well, and the problems that democracies bring about.
Oh, and Callicles even says at one point, like, see if I can find the reference, but he says the intelligence should rule. I think it's at 490a. I mean, that's what Socrates says in the Republic. So there's a way in which there's a kind of agreement between them, as you mentioned, that the wise should rule. Now, it's not clear that Callicles thinks that Socrates is actually one of the wise people. And of course, the other difference is that Callicles, I think, evinces a strong desire to rule, whereas Socrates notoriously does not want to rule and says that philosophers or the wise would have to be compelled to rule. So Callicles thinks that, I mean, as you mentioned, you alluded to this a little bit earlier, that Callicles thinks that the strong should not just rule, but that they should get something. They should get more. And so it should pay to be strong. One other small point, this is at 482E, just above where you left off. when he's talking about the law, and he's like, the things that are people who do this, they don't do what's fine by nature, and that's kalos or kalon. So it's not beautiful or fine or noble by nature. And here's where I think that Callicles might have some residual attachment to the noble or to moral things. That I suspect that, to use some anachronistic terminology, that Callicles sort of sees himself as being above or beyond good and evil. Come on, Socrates, it's just lions and lambs, and this justice stuff is for the birds. It's all about satisfying your pleasure and all this. And yet he still is somehow attached to the noble. And I suspect that one of the things that Socrates is, in many of the dialogues, showing people like Thrasymachus, Protagoras, Callicles, people who think that they have liberated themselves from their concern for the noble haven't, in fact. And in fact, especially some of the more violent reactions against morality are precisely people who are still deeply moral. So it's sort of obvious, right? Thrasymachus is saying, I mean, think about the Republic. How dare you mislead these young people into thinking that there's actually justice? We both know there's not justice. Well, where's that moral indignation coming from, if not a sense of morality? And so there's this weird way in which these loud, angry, nasty immoralists still have some latent attachment to moral things. I mean, well, it's at a certain point, Socrates, I think, is testing Callicles' capacity for shame, and Callicles keeps saying, "Fine, fine, I'm fine with that, fine with that." And then ultimately, he says something such that it provokes Callicles to say, "Aren't you ashamed to bring this up?" Which I think is an indication that no, that Callicles, we've struck the nerve finally. We know what shames Callicles, and so he is attached to some moral things.
I like that reader a lot. That's very good. It also tends to maybe open the door or crack it open a little bit about whether or not Callicles, this dialogue is more pedagogical for Callicles than he wants to let on. Because he is very recalcitrant, and he says, "I'm only doing this for Gorgias, and like we can just move this along." But no, you're right. Then he seems to push back, which means that he is tracking, right? He is watching what's going on. No, I like that a lot. He kind of just pushing us forward a bit. Yeah, Socrates, we kind of talked about this. He appreciates his frankness.
Yes.
487a. And he kind of he would do one thing I like about the Gorgias too, that maybe I don't remember as much in the Republic, but particularly as you said, like for maybe for students that are first coming to this and want to engage in something longer. One thing that he does here that I actually greatly appreciate is that Socrates summarizes a lot. He says, like, okay, let's take your points and let's summarize. Do you still hold this? And even at certain sections in the dialogue, I think 2 or 3 times, even in this section, he stops and he's like, okay, let's restart. By the way, are these all the premises? That type of hand-holding isn't always there, if that makes sense. And I think that, now we can push on his own rhetoric there and why he's doing it. Yeah. But it is something that's kind of helpful. But at 488b, he restates what he hears the position to be. And he says, the superior should take by force what belongs to the inferior, that the better should rule the worse, and the more worthy have a greater share than the less worthy. Right? So that's like our working thesis at the moment.
Yeah. And Callicles says, I say these things and more. Can I backtrack for just a second? I want to read this. This is at 45a. This is one of my favorite. So Callicles is like, there's the other strange confusion in the Callicles soul is he simultaneously wants to beat Socrates up and benefit him. Right? In other words, he wants to knock him out of what his perceived, he thinks Socrates is sort of naive or foolish or something. He wants to teach him, but he also wants to punch him in the mouth. Callicles is like, look, I like philosophy fine. It's totally appropriate for young people. When I see a 16-year-old doing philosophy, I'm like, that's fantastic. I love it. But when I see a grown man doing it, I want to punch him in the mouth. He sounds like a child to me. He's lacking in outspokenness, too sensitive to shit. What's going on? We know that he's insufficiently educated, right? And so he's the curious thing is that he wants to, like, if he seems confused, like if he really wanted to harm Socrates, he would withhold his wisdom from him. But instead he wants to teach him that he's wrong. And so there's another instance, like you mentioned at the very beginning, like what you're doing, what we're doing with New Thinkery, what Zena Hitz is doing, there's this erotic desire to kind of teach. It's even there in Callicles. Like he wants to teach Socrates. But now, of course, he wants to beat him up at the same time. So maybe it's not the best education.
No, this is good. I appreciate these kind of subtle defenses of Callicles, because maybe it is too easy, and I'm probably guilty of as well, to just chalk him up as just like pure, unadulterated, appetitive power. And maybe
that's how he'd like to see himself, probably. So I admit that, but it's just not clear that he can consistently hold that. I guess that's my puzzle.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. What do you take of so as kind of stepping into that
Sure.
around 488D?
Okay.
He starts asking him, this is like typical Socrates, right? We're going to get into some grammatical questions. Like,
Right.
so when you say this, what is this definition? Like, what does
Right.
this mean? And I took this section as this is where he kind of, um, I thought it was really interesting that he tries to point out that the many are ruling both by law and by nature. And I took this as Socrates, as kind of a brilliant rhetorical point. He
Yeah.
steps into the argument of
Yeah.
Callicles
Yeah. Yeah.
and adopts his own terms. And he's like, well, wait, who's ruling now? Like,
Yeah.
who's the superior? And he tries to point out, like, well, then wouldn't the many who's making our laws be both superior by both law and nature?
Good.
And Callicles' pushback on this is basically like, you're playing word games.
Yeah. I mean, this is what Callicles doesn't realize, that if you think through his position seriously, it's basically legitimizes any existing regime because they won. And so they're by definition the more powerful, like the many won. But again, I think you see his latent, like he finds something immoral about the fact that the many rule. They're uneducated. They don't, this is why the intelligence should rule, this sort of stuff. But yeah, no, it's a beautiful, I mean, this is what Socrates, and I suspect that this is what Callicles is what Thrasymachus, I think this is why Thrasymachus loses in the Republic. He expects a kind of moral response from Socrates. And Socrates doesn't give him the moral response. He's like, okay, let's grant that you're right, that it's just about power. Okay, then I think these sophists, sort of educated people, these rhetorically educated people, they're ready for it's wrong. How dare you say? And Socrates is like, no, fine. Okay, power. It's all about who rules. But then wouldn't that be true of the many? They have the power. And this frustrates them. And I think that's, using the own logic and trying to think it through to its conclusions frustrates someone like Callicles. But I think it's true in a way. Like, if all it is about power, then that legitimizes, if that's what's just, then whoever's ruling is by definition more powerful.
And so I love those sections too, because you can tell that, like you said, they have this rhetoric. They're expecting him to kind of give a moral argument. And then what we do is we watch him out rhetoric the rhetoricians.
Yeah.
Right.
No, that's for sure.
Which is like a beautiful, like, untying of a knot that it's just, it's wonderful to watch, which then typically opens them up, or at least opens up the audience to then some real actual conversation on like the philosophic side. Right. So if we can move some of this rhetoric out of the way and see that it collapses, then maybe we can actually start to find like some footing, like something that's actually solid.
I think that you put your finger on one of, there's so many important strands in this dialogue, but one of them is distinguishing, I think, between rhetoric and dialectics. So the art of conversation and the art of speaking publicly, or something like this. And, I think the word rhetoric is somewhat equivocal. So if we're going to use it loosely, which is just to sort of use persuasive speech, it's clear that Socrates uses that. It's clear that he uses tricks. It's clear that he uses rhetorical devices. It's clear that he has rhetorical questions. But if we understand rhetoric to be a particular kind of speech to a particular kind of audience, that's not what Socrates is practicing here. And I suspect that one of the reasons he goes to Gorgias in the first place is I think he's actually interested in, can I learn this large public speaking thing, which I suspect, therefore, Socrates, why would he be motivated at this particular point in life to learn rhetoric? I suspect because he knows that at some point in his life, it might become necessary to defend himself against charges. This is alluded to by Callicles, by the way, in the dialogue, right? You would never be able to defend yourself. And so I think you're right that there's this way in which Socrates is rhetorical, but I think that what he seems to have a mastery over is dialectic. Like, he just completely disposes of Gorgias. He completely disposes of Polus. And then Callicles jumps in and said, the only reason you're able to defeat those guys is because they had shame. You're dealing with me. I'll be straight with you. I won't let that sort of stuff get in the way. And again, it's like the conversational approach versus the rhetorical approach. I mean, in the Protagoras, again, when Protagoras realizes that he's losing to Socrates in conversation and dialectics, he tries to give a big speech to get out of this method isn't working. Let's do big rhetoric. And Socrates says, I can't do that. I'm just a simple country boy from Attica. Please, can we just have conversations? And yes, no. I think Protagoras is aware that he can't out jab Socrates. He wants big right hooks and big left hooks, if that makes sense. And here again, Callicles, I think, doesn't quite understand this difference between conversation and rhetoric, as it were.
Okay, so maybe we'll lean into that. So maybe
please.
I'm with Callicles on not understanding the distinction.
Yeah, sure.
So the dialectic and the rhetoric, as you presented it, makes sense to me. But what do we think is being exercised here or being alluded to insofar as the good side of this? So, for instance, when I read this with some first-time readers, his antagonisms, right? His rhetoric against rhetoric being an art, right? It's like, oh, it's like you're a baker, you're a pastry
Right,
maker.
right, right.
Go make cupcakes, like whatever you're doing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like obviously, there's a lot of pushback of like, no, there's no way that rhetoric is not an art, and we see this. I think in the Gorgias section, it's not entirely like clear to that. He just seems to be very antagonistic against this.
Yeah.
Polus, we get a few allusions here in Callicles. I think to throw out a thesis is that no, there has to be some type of good rhetoric. Because when you talk to Polus, it's alluded to, it's implied, but he never actually says it. So, for instance, he critiques Polus, going by memory, he critiques Polus's rhetoric because it clearly doesn't understand the nature of things and its
Right,
causes.
right, right, right.
Well, that's philosophy. So
Yeah,
it seems like, I mean, so let me just throw something out here and feel free to,
yeah,
tear it apart. Is that it seems like in certain ways, what's being presented here is the same way that poetry is handled in a republic. That if you read poetry in the republic on a surface level, it's like, oh, Plato hates poetry.
yeah.
Like he's against Homer, he's against this, like etc. But then you're like, wait, he's teaching me through a dialogue. He's teaching me through poetics. He's telling me myths and little stories and Gygas ring and all these things. And so it seems here, and in Callicles, it actually becomes more explicit, right? He actually says there's a true oratory.
Yeah.
That it seems then, if I had to articulate something, is that why this rhetoric that Gorgias and Polus and Callicles is not an art, it's just flattery, is because its final teleology, its telos, is in pleasure. It doesn't know the nature of things. It doesn't know causes. It's not actually trying to communicate what is good and just. And so it seems then that there must be a good rhetoric, maybe one that's been brought in Christian terms, right? It'd be a baptized rhetoric, a rhetoric that has been brought under philosophy.
Sure.
That I guess, like say in there, I don't know how to make that. Maybe I'm using rhetoric too broadly because I see Socrates using it because
Yeah.
isn't he not trying to communicate what's good and just? And even he himself slips into a few longer monologues in this. So, is there a good rhetoric that we're supposed to pull out of this dialogue?
Yeah. Yeah, that's an excellent question. First, I'll say I agree with you about poetry. I mean, it's clear to me that Plato is a poet. I mean, the allegory of the cave. And Socrates, even in the Republic, admits at one point in passing that he's had a love for Homer since he was a child. And so I take his criticism of poetry to be serious, but not to be his final word, just like I take his criticism of rhetoric here to be serious, but not his final word. I suspect he does think rhetoric is an art. This is why I think, his grandson teacher, Aristotle, writes a book called The Art of Rhetoric. And so I just suspect that what he figures out quickly is that Gorgias doesn't have it, which is to say, at the beginning of Aristotle's rhetoric, Aristotle mentions the people who seem to be kind of good at this by a kind of knack. And it's possible that Gorgias may have learned some tricks and he may have had just a very good knack at this kind of a thing. But the deeper problem, I suspect, is that, so good rhetoric, bad rhetoric. Here's my understanding of what rhetoric is. I get this from a teacher of mine, but also from the Gorgias especially. The boxing example is where I draw this from. Gorgias talks about how rhetoric is like boxing. Don't blame the boxing teacher if the boxing student comes home and punches his mom in the mouth. It's not the boxing teacher's fault. The boxing teacher is just teaching boxing. So just transpose that to today, self-defense. If someone were teaching a self-defense class to a group of young ladies and one of them went home and just beat up on somebody, we wouldn't blame the trainer. So I suspect that rhetoric is morally neutral. But even this, Gorgias didn't recognize, because if it's morally neutral, it can be used for very bad moral things. And so the problem is, I think, again, from Aristotle's point of view, would be it's like a gun. And, not that I'm necessarily a huge gun advocate, but like if we get rid of guns are bad, so we should get rid of them. This is a very common belief by people, right? I think Aristotle's saying this is just like guns. Like if you get rid of guns, the only people with guns will be bad people. If we don't teach good people rhetoric, the only people with rhetoric will be bad people, in which case those of us who are good will be victims of those who understand rhetoric. And so there's a way in which one has to learn rhetoric precisely to inoculate oneself against people who can do this to you and manipulate you. There's also the ways in which rhetoric is very useful in democratic sort of republics. That seems true to me. And so, yeah, I think that what Socrates is after is, you called it a true rhetoric. I think that's what he calls it here in the Gorgias. And I think that it would be aware of this. Now, I'll just say, I suspect that Plato's Apology is an extraordinary work of rhetorical art. It has an order. But by the way, despite shooing anywhere, he says, sort of a praeteritio at the beginning, gosh, I'm a simple country boy from Athens. I've never been in court. I don't know how to give a speech. I'm just going to speak haphazardly without any order. I don't know what I'm doing. Point one, point 1A, point 1AB, point 2 AB. Like, it's like, holy crap, this is extremely well organized. What are you talking about? So, like, it's clear to me that Socrates does learn rhetoric. I'll just confess, I think he taught rhetoric. I'll give some evidence from that, I think, is to be found in Xenophon's Memorabilia. And so I think it's something he learned and taught, but it's in Aristophanes' Clouds, by the way, that he taught rhetoric. And so, yeah, I do think there is a good rhetoric, and I think there's a bad rhetoric. And I think one of the reasons that we need rhetoric is precisely because the good and good people are vulnerable in the world. Simply being true is not good enough, that one needs a kind of defense. And by the way, I'm teaching this class on rhetoric, as I mentioned, Deacon, and I know you know scriptures better than I do. One of the passages I have students read is from 1 Corinthians. I think it's the 2nd chapter, where Paul sort of says he's not going to do rhetoric. But the whole chapter it's like rhetorical device after rhetorical device after rhetorical device. And Paul, maybe you can speak to his own education, but it seems to me that Paul would have had a classical rhetorical education. I mean, so here, even the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, it's like, blessed are the blessed are the blessed are, right? So there's this repetition at the beginning of sentences. It's inverted word order. It's even a little curious in the Greek. I have no clue if that's the Aramaic. Nobody does. But so, like, even the scriptures themselves are highly rhetorical. I mean, Jesus uses rhetoric. Paul uses rhetoric. Jesus spoke in parables. This is a particular kind of rhetoric, according to Aristotle. And so that all these things are not necessarily bad. And I think that the students I teach tend to have the presupposition that rhetoric is bad, and they're a little put off when they realize that people whom they admire made great use of rhetoric, not just the Bible. Augustine has this nice defense of rhetoric I forget what the name of the work is, but I just read it recently. But then also great, Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is a masterpiece of rhetoric, the second inaugural, right? So you go through all these examples. Rhetoric has a very bad name. I think it's for good reason, but then I think when you think it through, you can see that there actually is a good use of rhetoric.
I think it's really well said. Yeah, I think sometimes there's a knee-jerk reaction when you read the Gorgias that he's just against rhetoric.
Right.
And I think that and obviously there's reasons for that, particularly at the beginning of the dialogue. But I think as you kind of move through, you realize that the reason he can make some of these bombastic claims that, like, well, you're just like a pastry chef, which I think, is so. I think it was somewhat tailored to Polis, because
no question.
Polis to be spirited, and so to tell
how dare you insult my teacher in front of me?
Right.
Yeah.
So you tell the real spirited guy that he's like a cupcake maker.
Yeah.
You're going to get a reaction. So no, I think that was really well said. I appreciate you parsing that out.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Let's look at the or I could be rude to you too if you wanted to feel more at home.
No, it's fine. It's a nice change of pace.
So one of the things I think is really interesting is the treatment of pleasure, and so we kind of get into this at 491D or so. Sure. Right, so Callicles, like superior man, or whatever stand-in term we want to use for this, right? The one that's superior by nature. Like, Callicles makes this like really fascinating argument of like, no, he shouldn't be self-controlled. There shouldn't be self-discipline, right? You should allow appetites to grow as large as possible and not restrain them, right? And actually, the quote, a lack of discipline is shameful. That's just that's a creation of the many. That's a creation of the weak to try. Like, that's what the lambs come up with to try and get the lion to stop eating them. Right. Well, you just need to be self-disciplined and have some, egalitarianism, and we all get the same share and things like this.
No. Indulge. All the pleasures, bodily pleasures.
One thing I really like about reading Plato, just kind of coming from my own background, is that today, like, if we encounter arguments like this, it's like straight hedonism, et cetera, like so many of us, just, myself included, like our knee-jerk reaction is to go to some Christian principle.
Sure.
And just good rhetoric, if you don't adhere to Christianity, using Christ as a source typically doesn't bear a whole lot of weight. And so one of the reasons I actually really like reading Plato is it's like, no, we can have someone who actually can observe by nature that this can't be correct, like just this unlimited amount of pleasure, even though there's a caveat there, which we'll hopefully get to, which is that even Plato ends these arguments with a religious myth.
Right.
And I think we have to take that somewhat seriously.
Oh, no doubt. Yeah.
But here we see, this kind of this lack of discipline, et cetera. And this leads into, actually Socrates asks him in 492E, uh, is this really happiness?
Right.
Which anytime, if you see justice or happiness in any of the Platonic dialogues, always like put a big box around them, right? This is a
Yeah,
key
sure.
theme. And obviously there's a funny little retort that Callicles has of like, well, if happiness is actually being fulfilled and you don't have need, then aren't stones and corpses the most happiest of things because they have
Right.
no needs?
Right. Right. Right.
And so this, I took that as, I think if you pushed back on that, obviously there's a distinction between not having a need and having a need and it being satiated. Therefore, you're not in need of it, right? Those two things are distinct, if that makes sense.
No, sure, sure. This is one of my favorite passages. I don't know how comfortable you are going through these examples, but
No, okay, well, no, I'm happy to defer to you because we've got the jars example, we've got good stuff. So no, like take it away.
your audience is okay with vulgarity, I suppose. Yeah, so Callicles is
Oh
trying to
yeah,
make a defense of just shameless pursuit of hedonism, as you said. Pleasure, 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 as much pleasure as possible. Callicles says, living pleasantly consists in this, in keeping as much as possible flowing in. That's the best, just constant, just wine coming in all the time. I will tell you, only once in my life have I consumed too much alcohol, and it wasn't that pleasant, in fact, to have it all. It was a
right.
mistake, but only once. And then Socrates, I mean, I already alluded to this, but I think Callicles thinks that he's a hedonist, but he can't consistently sort of maintain that position because Socrates, okay, well, what if a guy just does this all the time? So the best life is just constantly satisfying your pleasures. And then Socrates gets kind of filthy, actually. So if much flows in, Socrates asks, this is at 494b, is it then necessary that what goes away also be much and that there be some big holes for the outflowings? Now, I don't want to make this too graphic, but clearly he's talking about defecation. Like, so the best life would be having a big hole to evacuate yourself, right? And a big hole to push stuff into, right? And we're talking about bodily stuff, but it's, there's some other indications here, I suppose. And then Callicles says, yeah, of course. And then Socrates says, well, then you're just talking about this little bird that eats and poops at the same time. Like, and that can't be the best life, can it? And then, of course, one can't help but think of like vomitoriums in ancient Rome and sort of these weird sort of, and I don't know if you've seen Idiocracy, but the guy who's sitting in the lazy boy that's also a toilet while he's eating like Cheetos or something like this. He's like, this is the best life, right? And Callicles is like, yes, fine. I'm fine with that. That's the best life. And Socrates is like, okay, I'm so glad that you don't hold back through shame. You're very impressive, Callicles. And Socrates says, okay, what about a guy who just scratches all the time? What do you think about that? Callicles says, yeah, that's pleasure as well. That's pleasant. And Socrates says at 494 D, so if pleasantly, then also happily. Certainly. So if I just have a rash and I scratch it all the time, that's happiness. Callicles is like, yes, that's happiness. And then Socrates very delicately asks, what if it's not his head he's scratching? What if it's scratching something else? Eyebrow raised, yes? In other words, I suspect he's asking, what if one satisfies oneself in the manner of Onan? Your listeners may get this reference. And Callicles is like, fine, this is happiness. And then he says, what about a catamite, which is a fellow who has interesting sexual proclivities, let's just say. And Callicles then he sort of pounds his fist on the table and says, aren't you ashamed to bring this up? That's a bridge too far. And so I think that's the example of, and we've seen some other traces of Callicles actually is still attached to the noble, which the sort of opposite or one opposite of the noble is shame. And here that's shameful to bring that up, Socrates. And I think Socrates was just pressing and pressing and pressing to see, I know that you're not being honest with me or yourself right now. You do have some limit where you think that it would be shameful for a human being to live that way. And I've found it. And I've exposed that now for Gorgias. Callicles becomes much more recalcitrant after this point. I suspect because he realizes he's been shown that he doesn't know what he's talking about. But this is just a very common thing. I'll mention in passing that I once attended a conference of libertarians, who are nice people, by the way. I like libertarians. I tend to be somewhat sympathetic to them. But who thought that the free market could solve all problems, every single problems. I won't go through all the examples, but I was young and stupid, and I just read the Gorgias. And so I just kept saying, well, what about a market for this? And, drugs. And they're like, well, of course, that's much safer than, okay, what about a market for organs? And yes, of course, this is the best, more efficient way. And then I just kept pressing until finally I mentioned a market for something in particular that I saw their collective gasp at. And they realized that, no, maybe some things there shouldn't be a free market for. Maybe some things it's okay to say, let's not let that be for sale in the marketplace. But it took some prying. And then, of course, they immediately recovered. They remembered that they were good libertarians and sort of tried to forget that they had been exposed to this. So I think this is it's a very tiny little bit piece of evidence, but it's a piece of evidence that there's a shred of morality still in Callicles' soul. There is a limit. That's too far.
I think that was really well said. Yeah, I think he pushes, right, the pedagogical nature of the examples and why I push into the absurdity and even into the vulgar is
Yeah.
really to kind of draw this out of like, there's no way this is actually true, nor do you actually
Right.
believe it,
Right.
right? And I liked the example of the guy on the lazy boy, right? So because I think what he's going to and where the dialogue I think is going to go is that the problem, and I guess the jars example gave this to a certain degree,
Right.
is that the problem with just saying I constantly need to consume
Right.
is that means you constantly also have to have a need.
Yes.
And if it's the delight of consumption itself,
Right.
So for Lent, we read Dante's Inferno, and you think about like the gluttonous, right? So the delight comes from the consumption itself, regardless of the need. Then you constantly just have to consume, and you think of when Virgil is taking Dante the Pilgrim into that third circle, Cerberus is the guardian, and it's not magical honey cakes that he feeds him; it's muck. It's that's that disgusting muck that's in that circle. And the reason that Cerberus eats it and is satisfied, and I think Dante the poet is showing us there that this type of consumption is irrational. It doesn't actually make sense. And it just becomes just simply about consuming. And so I think you see something analogous going on in this section where Socrates just has to push Callicles to the point.
It's also you're totally right, but it's also curious because like we already talked about this, but that's not what Callicles has in mind for himself, right? He's talking about ruling. Like that, I mean, in a way, he wants to say shame is what constrains people from consuming. It's what constrains people from trying to rule, blah, blah. But in other words, he already is implicitly drawing this hierarchy in his own mind between the good use of this totally natural freedom and this low use of it, scratching oneself and filling oneself like you're an empty vessel. And so, but even that distinction is already, of course, not all pleasures are as equal as otherwise we might think. And so he really does have a revulsion at the low. And that's why Socrates is going this direction and not let's examine the people who are grabbing political power or something like this, to try and expose that Callicles thinks that this is beneath human dignity or something like this.
Well, Callicles seems to take on at times the disposition of like a 13-year-old debating online, where I think he says this somewhere. I don't know if it's in this section. I apologize. Where basically he says, yeah, the only reason I'm holding to this line is because if I don't, I'd be inconsistent.
Yeah.
And so it's like at that point, it's like, well, what is the actual dialogue that's happening, right? So he just becomes, he's just kind of putting up, and I think that's why this last section has some of the nature it does, where it has to circle back. Even Socrates says, okay, we keep coming back to the same point about craft. I think one of the reasons we do it is because it basically goes back into one of your points between rhetoric and dialectic, is to what degree can the dialectic progress towards truth if your interlocutor is recalcitrant and not actually being, not acting in good faith. And that's why Gorgias has to jump in several times to try and move this thing along, because I don't think Callicles is going to take it where it needs to go.
Right. No, I agree with that. Yeah. I mean, yes. And, I don't know if you want to pivot to the myth, but I suspect that one of the functions of the myth is Socrates' awareness that Callicles is impervious to argument at this point. But I'll also point out, by the way, that at 493D, just to make somewhat curious, Socrates, this is long before Socrates does give the myth, he sort of says, my arguments aren't persuading you, but I bet even if I tell myths that also won't persuade you. And Callicles says at 493D, yeah, that's right. You're absolutely right. No myth will persuade me. So then there's another curiosity of why does Socrates give the myth if Callicles has just told you the myth won't work on him? Maybe, of course, maybe the answer is Callicles doesn't understand that. Maybe it will, but it's still very curious, like why Socrates turns to a myth at the end, and it's about punishment in the afterlife. So
yeah, I think one that dovetails a little bit into what we mentioned earlier of like who is benefiting from the dialogue, right? Out of all the people listening, like you can make an argument. Obviously, I agree with you that I think Gorgias something's being revealed to Gorgias.
Yeah,
there's these young men, right, that apparently had just listened to Gorgias give. I don't know if we know how many are there, but Gorgias had just given this rhetorical speech, and they're still there in a public setting. Right. This is like, I mean, maybe something it's mundane, but that would be analogous to this. Is sometimes you find yourself on X, right, responding to someone and you're like, I don't think this person's actually going to like listen to what I have to say,
Yeah.
but it's the public square, and someone else might actually benefit from what I'm actually
Oh yeah,
telling this
very
person,
good.
right?
So the benefit from the myth is for others, you think?
Yeah, I don't know if I mean Callicles. I mean, you've made me think more about Callicles' openness and his
Yeah.
responsiveness
Yeah.
to being told, but it's so buried down between, but beneath like this veneer that he has that I'm not sure how well we can track it. But I'm
Yeah.
more interested in someone like, is the myth beneficial for Gorgias? Like, is Polis
Polis.
open, right,
Yeah.
to it?
Yeah.
Are the young men who are listening
Right.
open to it, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, that's not to say that I don't think the myth is without problems. Right? They have the bodies are somehow punished, right? So we don't, but it's weird because we don't have bodies or something in the afterlife. There's visible evidence on the souls, I guess,
Mhm.
of the scars for the bad things from the bad things that they've done or something like this. Yeah.
As a side,
Also, there's like this threat of eternal damnation or eternal punishment. When Socrates had earlier made some mention of the notion that people who do wrong things do so involuntarily. And it would be curious if Socrates' gods in this instance believe what he has said, in which case it might not make sense to punish people forever for something like if they did it out of ignorance or something like this. Maybe educating them is the better sort of example. Yeah.
so maybe just to anchor some of the things we talked about in the
Yeah.
text. So at 500C is when he actually explicitly mentions that we're talking about the way we're supposed to live.
Right.
Again, as a first-time reader, like this is where I really started to enjoy this dialogue, that we've moved on from the purpose of rhetoric to what is rhetoric in service of.
And just a small point, by the way, we've been sort of hammering away at Callicles pretty hard. I mean, he's the one who's in a way responsible for elevating the theme or the topic that they're investigating. I mean, he realizes that we're really not talking about simply rhetoric. We're talking about what the best way of life is. So yeah, just to your point, I mean, he's responsible for, and in a way, I think that shows he's more serious than Polis. Like the stakes are much higher. But yeah, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's why the lukewarm don't tend to bring out the truth, right? So the hot and the cold do, because you actually have something there to engage with. But the lukewarm, it's too malleable. They don't. It's milk toast. You don't get to
Yeah.
like do anything. So no, I think Callicles. This goes into the earlier conversation of like, is Callicles a real person, or was he basically invented because Plato needed someone like this to
Right.
bring out the truth of the dialogue? And you're not going to get that from Gorgias or Polus. You're just not going to.
That's right.
So yeah, if you look at 503A, again, this is where he actually, for the first time maybe, is compares that there's actually two different types of rhetoric. So he makes more explicit what I think has been haunting a lot of the dialogue. So there's the flattery, the shameful, but then there's this one that, getting souls of citizens to be as good as possible,
Right.
and striving valiantly to say what is best. And I think your comments have made me think about whether or not he's engaging in that rhetoric specifically because he's more dialectic, or this is a rhetoric that Socrates sees could exist if someone had the skill set to do it.
Yeah, and by the way, Socrates says, do you know anybody who practices this good rhetoric? And Callicles says, I can't think of, by Zeus, I can't think of anyone. By the way, his teacher's right there.
Right.
So not Gorgias, right?
Right. Again, I think there's so many moments in this that are deeply pedagogical to Gorgias.
But also, by the way, not even Themistocles or Pericles, right? Like Washington, Lincoln, they sort of get discarded, right?
Correct.
Because Callicles says, well, what about those guys? And Socrates says, I don't know. I'm not so sure. Yeah.
Which is funny because it's the same kind of group of men that get discarded in the Meno.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
They're not truly being virtuous.
That's right.
I found it interesting on, let's see. He makes some good arguments about, obviously he's leading Callicles on, or at least Callicles is allowing him to develop his argument. Around like 506C, he makes some good arguments. Going back, he's building, I think, upon his conversation with Polus about intermediate goods. And he doesn't use the phrase final good, but that's like just to kind of present that concept. So obviously he's maturing in the conversation here that no, the pleasant is not the same as the good. And so we have to seek what's pleasant or painful for the sake of the good. So sometimes we have to do painful things because for the sake of the good. And so he shows that there are intermediate goods, and trying to show that, the pleasant and the good are not the same. Kind of, again, going back to that, can life just be this constant consumption of pleasurable things?
Yeah, no, that seems, it's persuasive to me.
And I found it interesting
if
too.
If your arm had some disease, you'd cut it off, something like this.
Right. And he gives just as like as moderns, what I found really interesting is when he talks a little bit about friendship, and then at 512D, he says the good in life is not reducible to self-preservation.
Yeah.
And I loved that line. There has to be something more to this life than simply self-preservation and pleasure. Simply like so. Basically, Callicles is presenting this narrative where it's basically like I try to preserve for the sake of pleasure,
No.
right? Or at least that's like the caricature that he's presented, right? Because he
No,
doesn't want to become the tyrant.
yeah, and by the way, Socrates turns this manhood business back onto Callicles, right? Because I think Callicles had been insisting, "I'm a man and you're a boy, and you, Socrates, you do stuff that young boys do." And Socrates says, "The real man, the true man, must reject living at any cost whatsoever." Right, and so it's Socrates seems to be trying to wrest back from Callicles this notion of manliness or courage. Like, no, actually, real men don't try to live their lives for as long as possible. They're willing to there are other things more important than mere life, it seems. And of course, Socrates, as we know, seems to have lived that out. In fact,
Yeah, it's wonderful because you can see when you read slowly that Socrates will bring back Callicles' rhetoric against him later
yeah,
on without a lot of fanfare. So even like the "I'll knock you in the jaw"
yeah.
comes back.
Oh, is that right? I missed
Yeah, it
that.
comes back at the end of in the myth, and
Okay.
so there's this like book ending, if you will.
Huh.
Maybe before we jump into the myth, though,
Yeah.
your thoughts. I mean, because sometimes Socrates just drops these statements, and he says at 521D that he is the only one to
Oh,
practice the true political craft, the
yeah.
practice of true politics. So the guy who's constantly told us, I didn't want to get involved in politics, I have no interest in this. We see this from the Apology. He says,
Right.
oh, just as a side note, I'm the only one in Athens who actually practices true politics. What does he mean by this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's the art of politics. It's the techne,
Mhm.
I think. Craft. I think you said craft. Gosh, I mean, one is tempted always to read such things with a certain amount of irony, but I suspect that he's being somewhat serious here. And we think about politics is also an equivocal term. So, if what we mean by politics is he's engaged in governing large scale the community, I would say the answer is no, he doesn't. Just like does he engage in rhetoric large scale in the community? I think the answer is no. But he does engage in rhetoric in the small scale. And I wonder if what he's not saying here is he doesn't actually engage in politics in the small scale as well. And that maybe politics in the truest sense is only possible, therefore, in the small sense. So what would politics be? What would politics really be? Trying to improve another human being with respect to virtue, make someone better. And if that's what Socrates means here, maybe that's what Socrates means here. That he's the only one who's actually, all these politicians come say they're going to help you and this, that, and the other, and maybe he's the only one who's genuinely helping people in this way.
I like that.
Yeah, it's very curious. I agree.
I took it, not nothing against what you said. I deeply appreciate that. I took it as, he's basically given us, I guess, a template, right? So
Yeah,
here's something that you're engaging in, but it's not a true art because you don't know the nature of things and you don't know its causes,
right.
which then leads us to believe that you have to take these arts, and for them to be true arts, they somehow have to be guided by philosophy. They have to know what's true and good, etc. And we see something similar with poetry in the Republic.
Mm-hmm.
So then it seems to me like he can just drop a different type of art and say, oh, by the way, I'm the only one who actually does the art of politics, but we have a framework by which to maybe discern what he means by that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. And he mentions in passing, maybe 2 or 3 lines down, medicine, doctors. And
Mhm.
so one wonders if what he has in mind here is that Socrates is like the only real soul doctor that there
Mhm.
is. He's actually improving the souls of people. I wonder if there's not something like that going on. Because you didn't do this in the Polis section, perhaps you sort of track the chart, and there are these analogies between medicine and pastry making and rhetoric and politics and all these things, and so that maps on. So maybe what he's saying is he's the only one who's looking to the genuine good of the souls of people.
Yeah, no, I think that would track really well
Yeah,
with the analogs that we've seen in this dialogue.
yeah.
Yeah, so let's look at the myth. We've kind of already done a little bit of a foray into it. It's probably one of my favorite
Oh,
parts.
awesome, cool.
I just
Why?
well, I mean, I mentioned this on the first episode, and both
Mhm.
the guys that I was discussing it with were like, "Oh yeah, because you're Catholic, you're Christian, so this thing about this punishment at the end and like this beauty and etc. makes sense." But I like it because the way I took it. So it's an interesting thing. So the narrative basically we had living judges judging living people,
Okay.
And this was causing all kinds of problems because if you're tall and you're handsome and whatever, oh, you're a good person, but actually you're really ugly on the inside,
Right.
and everyone's distraught because everyone's going to the wrong place for the afterlife. So you know what? We're going to have dead judges and we're going to have dead people. And so you take off all the adornments and you just have this naked soul. And I
Right.
think the reason I really liked it was because of what really captured my imagination. And maybe, I'm too into it to read it neutrally. But the image that really captured my imagination is that the unjust man treats his soul the same way a
Mhm.
tyrant treats a slave. And so as a
Interesting.
tyrant like beats his slave and he sees the scars of the injustice upon the slave, so too does the unjust man treat his own soul. So then at
Sure.
life, there's like this reckoning, and your body goes away, this adornment that can hide the ugliness. And what you see in front of you then is actually the way you've abused your own soul. So you see a soul that is scarred and bruised, etc.
Yeah, sure.
And this is what's presented to the judge, or the judges. I think
Yeah,
there's
judges. Yeah.
yeah, the three of them, and
Yeah.
therefore they see
Two
you.
judges and then a tie. There's one that only votes in a tie. Is that right? Minus.
I don't remember
Yeah.
the but you so anyway that's one of the reasons I really liked it, because I really enjoyed this picture because I thought it gave us an insight into what is it really when I commit an injustice. And this tailors into one of the whole sub themes of this entire dialogue, which is it's better to suffer something that's unjust than
Right.
to commit something and do something right that's unjust. And so why? Well, here in this myth, you see that, like, well, all those, if you're the tyrant, all the injustices that you participated in that you thought you benefited from, every single time you did that, you scarred your own soul.
Right.
You made yourself ugly. And so
Yeah.
now when you present, you don't have a beautiful soul, right? Like the philosopher would have, right? You don't have a beautiful soul. You have this ugliness. And I really enjoyed, just, as a moral read, I really enjoyed taking that type of approach to what actually happens to me when I commit an unjust act.
Yeah. So I would just using sort of it's a powerful image. Of course, the problem is that he sort of says we should strip the soul of the body and then look at the soul, but he speaks of the soul as though it were bodily.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to do this without using images of things we actually see. I mean, like I don't think that your soul has bruises, literally, right? But the idea that it has something like that is somewhat persuasive to me. And there is a way in which I think it actually manifests bodily. Um, you can see, I think you can see on people who've lived very bad lives that many of them, it takes an enormous toll on their outward appearance, for example. And I suspect that there's something to that. I mean, there's ways in which people have, I think, probably shouldn't name names. I knew a guy once who I thought was living a fairly immoral life, and he started having heart problems. And I honestly believed at the time that was probably the kind of natural consequence of him being dishonest with himself and not living up to the standards that he had for himself. And so you're right. I think in a way, as an image, as a myth, as a story, I think there is a way in which one harms one's own soul when one's doing bad things. And if that's true, I suspect that the Socratic point of view would be that therefore such people deserve pity, because it's sad. They're harming themselves. They're making their souls uglier. They're making their souls maimed and bruised and scarred. And no one would want that. Now, the curious thing is we look at people who have been harmed and think, therefore, they're deserving of punishment. It's curious in that regard as well. I don't quite know what to do with that.
Yeah, it's interesting with the talk about the you still have to think as the soul as like an image, something that can be
Yeah.
scarred, right? Because Dante runs into that exact same issue, right? We
Right.
talked about Dante's Inferno earlier, so he has to present the bodiless souls as basically bodied to have these images. But what's interesting is that even our Lord does this. So in the parable of Lazarus and the rich man,
Right.
Lazarus goes down into, they're in limbo,
Yeah.
and they can see each other, but
Yeah.
Lazarus rests his head on Abraham's bosom,
That's right. That's very good.
but they're without body. So
Yeah.
there's something here. I mean, one point is that all analogies fail at some point.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But I think that for me, what captured my attention is I thought it was sometimes this. I just feel like Plato just shifts into gear and presents incredibly beautiful images.
Yeah.
And people are drawn to different things. I tend to be drawn to these types of myths. I love the myths that are
You like the myth
presented
of
in
her at the
Plato.
end of the Republic, then, for example?
Yeah, I actually think, I mean, granted, this is the problem. Like, I read this one recently, and
Yeah.
so now I'm going to tell you that I like it more than
Yeah,
the
sure.
one in there. But if I read it, if I read The Myth of Ur sometime soon, but yeah, but like Guy Just Ring, right? Another one. Like,
Sure.
these stick in my head.
Yeah.
And I think that it shows you the power of these narratives to be instructive then on, how we live our life.
So you don't take the idea, the inclusion of a myth at the end to be an indication of a failure of the argument on Socrates' part. I can't persuade you using words, using reason, and so therefore I'll just tell you a scary story.
I can see that,
Yeah.
and I really can. In a certain way, I wonder to a degree how much I would believe that's actually true. One of the questions that I had, and I know we're kind of pushing up on time,
Fine.
is, how would Aristotle handle Callicles? Because, see, my point there is that you have Plato tends to end all these arguments with a religious myth. And you could say, on a certain way, that, yeah, this is a scare tactic or something like that, or his
Right.
philosophy ends. But I would wonder, like, to what degree can, I guess, pure philosophy, right?
Right.
Unaided natural reason
Right.
actually answer these questions?
Yeah.
Like, I actually, that's a question I have. It's not resolved
sure,
for me,
sure.
but to what degree can an actual natural reason tell Callicles it is
Yeah.
better to be virtuous and self-disciplined, even though you could live a life of pleasure as a tyrant, get everything you want, and then you die, and we're all the same?
The Aristotle question is a good one. I suspect that the answer, I mean, the ethics, he says at one point, I mean, the question of who the audience for the Nicomachean Ethics is a sort of interesting one. But I don't think the audience of that text is for people who are recalcitrant to reason. And so I suspect at the end of the ethics, he sort of says, look, and then people don't listen to you, and that's why you need the law, politics. And so I suspect that the answer is somebody like Callicles. I mean, this may be why it ends with a sort of very legalistic myth at the end, is that maybe the answer is for such people, we just need politics. And Aristotle does say, like, the perfectly virtuous man doesn't need a law. He's a kind of law unto himself and doesn't need but there are people who don't need that, or who can't do that, who can't discipline themselves, who won't live a virtuous life. And for them, we just need cops, something like that. I mean,
Yeah,
Callicles, if I were the town police officer, I'd say, keep an eye on Callicles.
yeah, no, that makes sense to me. But it's still, it's obviously it's probably not something to explore at the moment. But I'm still kind of captured by this question, because even then, why even live this good life? And what actually constitutes it as good? So I guess you could say, well, it's according to reason, and therefore you should do it simply because it accords with reason.
Right.
But then Socrates, tends to then always cap these arguments with some type of religious myth. But I think it's not simply. I don't think the myth is simply reducible to a scare tactic, because the thing it brings in that is unique is that there will be a final justice, that there will be a final reckoning in which you can't hide. You can't hide behind rhetoric. You can't hide behind power. You can't do anything.
Good point. Oh, really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. That's a really good insight. Because Callicles says to him, you won't be able to help yourself with a judge, this, that, and the other. And so the implication is that I, Callicles, can get out of any problem because I have rhetoric. But Socrates' myth shows him that in the afterlife, your rhetoric won't get you anywhere, because they'll strip you naked and look at your soul. That's very good. Yeah.
Yeah, it flips
rhetoric has no power here.
Right. Yeah, it flips it from the apology, right? So when we read it, we think, oh, look, Socrates will be defenseless when he goes to his trial. But actually, at the end of all things, it's Callicles actually that will be defenseless in his own.
That's
right?
very good.
So,
that's a very good insight.
But I think that's what it brings in that's really unique, is that there has to be for things to actually be just, there has to be a final reckoning, and that reckoning can't happen in this life. And so I can't reduce the myth to simply backing up the philosophy, because it seems like in a lot of ways the myth is that some type of, we call it religious, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
There has to be some type of final judgment to make everything just, because we didn't get to it, but he argues in here the whole cosmos is ordered according to justice, and the cosmos is not going to suffer injustice to win out in the end, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think that is very in line with what Socrates says, is that perfect justice cannot be brought into being in this world. And that, I think that what you said is very good. Yeah.
Well, I've deeply appreciated all of your comments and insights.
Thanks, Deacon. I've enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah, this is great. No, I appreciate it. Again, big fan of the new Thinkery.
Sure.
Thank you for coming on. Tell us where people can find more about you and your work.
Sure. Obviously, they can go to thenewthinkery.com. I have an academia site. I'm working on a book on Xenophon's Cyropaedia right now. Hopefully, that'll be out in about, let's say, 2 years. I'd like to finish it in a year, and then if past experience is any indication, it takes about a year to get it published. I've edited a volume of Xenophon's shorter writings. That's with Cornell Press. They can find that. I just did a law. Oh gosh, this isn't being published for 10 months. I write stuff occasionally for Law and Liberty or Thwart. I try to do like a semi-popular piece, popular very broadly understood. It's not like I'm sure, Lady Gaga or anything, but a sort of less scholarly kind of thing, at least once or twice a year. But they could find me. I'm out there. I'm on Twitter. I'm on X. I'm probably not very interesting because I don't do the kinds of things you were talking about. I try to exercise some discretion and moderation and not fight people. But the website, thenewthinkery.com. We have a Twitter handle at the New Thinkery. I'm Greg McBrayer 3 on Twitter. Or X, excuse me. It's no longer Twitter. My apologies to Mr. Musk. I don't want to be dojied out of existence. But they can find me anyway. And by the way, I've had a lot of folks reach out to me. I'm sure you have too, like you mentioned, I think before we started recording. I mean, people do reach out to me all the time. And it's always a pleasure to hear from folks who listen if they picked something up or if they just enjoy it. I welcome it. It's nice. It's nice affirmation that we're actually doing something worthwhile, which is, I think, what you and I are. That's why we're both doing it.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I appreciate your time and attention and everything I've learned this morning about Callicles. It's wonderful, and I appreciate your project and New Thinkery, and everyone should go check you out on X and go subscribe to your podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Deacon. It's been a pleasure. You've been doing great things. I've admired the success of this podcast, and I continue to look forward to what you'll be doing next.
Thank you so much. All right, everyone. Next week we'll be discussing "The lame shall enter first." We're actually going to take a break from Plato and discuss the short story, "The Lame Shall Enter First" by Flannery O'Connor with Dr. Brian Kimple of the Lyceum Institute. And then we'll move back into our studies on Plato. So pick up that short story and read it with us, and we will see you next week.